Come along here today to the unveiling of a plaque to a quite remarkable woman, local woman, Betty Tebbs. She was a member of one of the affiliate unions that formed Unite, the union, of which I'm the chair of the Bolton branch. Our branch, Bolton Trades Council, were very keen to get involved in raising monies to put together a short film to this, as I said, remarkable northern woman. She epitomised everything that is good about strong, northern, determined women. Her campaigning around peace, her work within the trade union movement, her work around equality, stretched her entire life. She had setbacks within her life, but her commitment to causes of socialism were unwavering. If she was here today, she'd have quite a lot to say about what's going on in this country, what we now call the Labour Party. She'd be a thorn in the side still, as she was a thorn in the establishment side throughout her entire life. So, as a branch and as a group of trade unionists and socialists in Bolton, we were just so overwhelmed and joyful to get involved in something such as this, because women like her need remembering for future generations to look at and inspire them, and hopefully future northern women growing up will follow in her footsteps, and if they can do half of what she did, that'd be fantastic.
Mum will be so proud today to see all these people here celebrating her, and especially in her hometown. Absolutely royal to think that she has a plaque on these gate posts, and sometimes you hated going through those gate posts, but nevertheless she did do, and she fought when she was inside. And my recollection of those gates are on a very foggy, icy November morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, when she was on picket, and I went with her down Clod Street and stood at the gates, and that's my memory of them, which is very real. But anyway, she went through those gates daily for 14 years, and she had good and bad days, but when she left a legacy that the women in that factory were paid the best rate for women in the paper industry in Britain. So that was a good thing. I'll just give you one instance of a comical instance on some of her national work. You'll all have heard of Greenham Common, and Mum went down there several times and stayed for a week or 2 weeks. But then one weekend in January, there was a big push to get women from all over the world to come and join hands around the base and show support. So we got a coach, we went down, and it was stressed by the driver, you must be back by 5 o'clock. I can't wait, I can only load you on. So we stood by the fence and we knew it was going to be breached. And luckily we got one of the openings near us. So in the scramble to get through before the police caught us and charged us, we ran, and she'd instilled in me this in the morning, don't separate, we've got to keep together. And I turned round and she wasn't there, and I thought, oh my God. And when I looked up, she was legging it like nothing on earth across a field with 3 coppers after her. And needless to say, they never caught her. Because she used to belong to Bury Athletic Club when she was younger, so she outran them all. And she got back dead on 5 o'clock, coming down the road when everybody was on the court.
I heard a line in a play which Betty's name was mentioned in, about a statue for Victoria Wood but nothing to celebrate Betty's life. and said, like everybody else does, who's Betty Tebbs? So I went home and started reading about her and just became fascinated with her and couldn't for the life of me understand why she wasn't celebrated. So I wrote the song, that inspired me to write the song, and then that didn't seem to be enough. I thought, well, if she's not celebrated, I'll do something about it. I'll do a plaque. How do you do a plaque? And it all went from there, and it's taken 3 years of raising the funding, making a friendship with Pat over the phone, who's an amazing woman. And here we are today. It's all culminated in this today, which has been great. I'm really proud.
Sometimes our history is airbrushed. Sometimes this story can be wrong. This story tells you what they think you need to know. And that's why Betty Tebbs deserves this song. Betty Tebbs, she fought for justice. Betty Tebbs, she fought for peace. Betty Tebbs for equality. Betty Tebbs, a legend indeed. 14, she had a conscience and a desire to put things right. Equal pay for boys and girls in the factory. And all her life she carried on that fight. Betty Tebbs, she fought for justice. Betty Tebbs, she fought for peace. Betty Tebbs for equality. Betty Tebbs, a legend indeed.
What happened, Unite published the booklet. 2,500 copies were published. It's a big union and they were distributed locally and nationally. The story is a great one. Pat's dad over there, he gave his life in the struggle against fascism. He actually said, I'm going off to fight fascism. And he gave his life in the Second World War. Betty was left in a very difficult situation as a single parent. She was a class fighter, and the booklet talks, for example, how she became involved in the struggle around Palestine. It talks about her struggle C&D. It's great that the C&D manor is here today, and that's what her story is about. She was a radical working class woman who achieved a great deal of things, and this is the situation. Do you actually succeed? And the fact is, Betty did succeed.
Elizabeth Smith was born at home, 26 Handley Street in Bury, Lancashire, on 10th of April 1918. During a critical phase in World War I, Betty's entrance coincided with the arrival outside Bury of a Zeppelin German airship, a new form of war that meant civilians could be targeted at home. 51 air raids caused 557 deaths and 1,358 injuries. Fortunately, the bombing raid near Bury in April 1918 was unsuccessful. Betty's two sisters, Alice, aged 11, and Olive, 6, now had another sister. Father, James Smith, a joiner, glazer, working as a handyman at a bleach works, had wanted a boy. Her name, Elizabeth, was chosen by her mother, Maria, maiden name Pullen. With finances tight, Maria supplemented the family income by taking in washing and by cleaning. On entering St Chad's Infants when she was 4, Betty discovered a natural aptitude for sport, especially running, which served her well when she later ran against Nellie Helsted, an Olympic bronze medal runner. Because of rheumatic fever, Betty required many months off school. She did, though, have an opportunity to go to grammar school, but her father, a progressive outside the home, refused to allow this. Aged 14, with no qualifications and no previous workplace experience, Betty struggled to find work on leaving school, as the registered number of unemployed people in the summer of 1932 was 3.5 million. Caused in part by the 1929 Wall Street crash, the Great Depression of the 1930s plunged much of Britain into abject poverty. Betty and a friend turned up at Wilde's paper mill at 7:30 a.m. daily for almost 3 weeks, only for their employment request to be rebuffed by the foreman. So, there was extra joy when the foreman unexpectedly told her to start the following Monday. 7:45 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. with an hour for lunch plus 7:45 a.m. to noon on Saturday. She was paid 10 shillings and sixpence. Betty and John, a young man of similar age, had been assistants to a skilled cutter and done the same tasks, some of which were dangerous because only in extreme circumstances would the machine be turned off. Yet, she now discovered John had been paid over 13 shillings 65p. The extra money was because he was male. Betty was shocked and angry. So, when a woman came round the workplace and asked Betty to join the National Union of Printing, Bookbinding and Paper Workers, she did so immediately. It transpired that all the women were members, but only a few men. By 1936, Betty had become highly proficient in learning how to sort the sheets of paper. She was placed with a competent sorter, thus earning additional wages from piecework. She was guaranteed a weekly minimum wage of 30 shillings, £1.50, more than in many other similar workplaces. After a long courtship, Betty married Ernest Whitwell, 3 years her elder, on 11th of November 1939, only months after listening to Neville Chamberlain announce Britain was at war with Germany. In 1940, Ernest declared he had received a positive reply from his employers to be removed from his reserved occupation. Betty was upset, but Ernest was determined to fight fascism. After going to France on D-Day with the King's Own Scottish borderers, he was advancing through the French countryside. When his previously regular letters home to Betty and his newly born daughter Pat were no longer arriving, the worst was subsequently confirmed: killed in action. Then, just 2 weeks later, Betty was informed that as a single parent, she would receive a much reduced allowance. This injustice ignited in Betty a resentment and heightened her political interests. She later remarked that prior to the war, she had not seen any connections between her work in the trade union movement and party politics. Betty's mother persuaded her to go on holiday with Pat to Brixham in July 1944, where she met Len Tebbs, a London soldier stationed nearby. Len had attended the William Morris School in Walthamstow, London. The teachers there were socialists and followed the teachings of Morris, an early communist. On leaving school to start work, Len had joined the Young Communist League and studied Marxism. It was agreed that when Betty returned north, where she started back at Wilde's paper mill, the factory where she had first worked, the new friends would correspond. When he visited her in Radcliffe, Len then shocked Betty by asking her mother, without Betty's permission, if he could marry the widowed woman. Betty was not yet willing to commit to a second marriage, but on Len's next visit, she agreed. On 6th of August 1945, Betty was left stunned by a newspaper poster stating that a nuclear bomb, the atom bomb, packed with uranium, had been dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, instantly killing over 130,000 people. Horrified, Betty could not get her workmates to change their opinions that the bombing had been undertaken to end the war with Japan. 3 days later, a second atrocity took place in Nagasaki, where a nuclear bomb cored with plutonium killed instantly between 60,000 and 70,000 people in that city. So was ushered in the nuclear era. Betty was left in further anguish when she later saw pictures of children dying in agony, with men, women and children dead in their thousands. Betty later remarked that, without deeply understanding at the time the whole implications of these horrific events, I knew they represented the ultimate in deliberate destruction in the history of humanity. It was then that I vowed again that I would work for world peace and against such atrocities for the rest of my life. The bombings were not aimed at ending the war in Japan, but in order to test nuclear weapons. Betty later cited statements by Field Marshal Montgomery, General Eisenhower and Admiral Leahy, President Truman's Chief of Staff, in defence of this contention. Betty believed the bombings were intended by the USA to show that they could dictate to any country what kind of society it should have. After Betty and Len married, they decided to live in Radcliffe, where there was already a family home. When Betty returned to the paper mill, Len soon afterwards found work at Triangle Valves, a Manchester engineering factory. Betty had become pregnant and was feeling unwell. It was decided she would not work, unlike when she was carrying Pat. Glyn was to be born without any complications. Len soon became active alongside other men in fighting for better wage and conditions. It was at Triangle Valves that the policy of working to rule was first employed, when negotiations with management were floundering. It later became an effective trade union policy. Len began selling the Communist Party newspaper, The Daily Worker, to around 1 in 3 of the workforce, and when Betty began reading the paper, the pair started discussing its contents. Betty's desire for political change then resulted in her joining the Labour Party, and she went canvassing when Ernest's sister Alice stood as a Labour candidate and was elected, only the second time a Labour councillor had represented the Radcliffe Hall ward. Labour had been elected into government after the war. Betty had great expectations for a better future. She was pleased when arms factories began making useful goods and council houses were built. The setting up of the NHS on the 5th of July 1948 was something that thrilled her, telling her daughter Pat that it was the best day of our lives. It was because it meant ordinary people did not have to pay to go to the doctor, as treatment no longer depended on how much money you had. Betty still owed the doctor £8 at the time and only became debt-free over 6 months later, after paying off the bill at 5 shillings 25p a week. Betty was also pleased when children's milk was subsidised. Betty and Len were left disappointed that Prime Minister Clement Attlee accepted martial aid from America that restricted Britain's ability to trade with the Soviet Union. Labour was removed from government in 1951 by the Tories, who remained in government until 1964. In 1952, Britain started a war in Malaya, where local people who had defeated the occupying Japanese army during World War II now wanted to run their own country, occupied by the British since the 18th century. British soldiers were sent to defeat the guerrillas and regain possession of the tin mines and rubber plantations, the bulwark of the Malayan economy. The Daily Worker reported atrocities by British soldiers and 200 Dayak headhunters employed to fight alongside them by the British government, who decapitated Malayan fighters. The paper published pictures of these horrors, including one of a British Royal Marine commander who was wearing a crucifix and a large smile while holding the head of a toothless Malayan woman in one hand and a toothless Malayan man in the other. Betty held up the pictures at work where many people were certain they were fake, a view echoed by many media outlets. However, Oliver Littleton, the Colonial Secretary, confirmed the pictures were genuine. Nevertheless, Betty's local MP, Mr. Walter Fletcher, a Tory with shares in tin mines and rubber plantations in Malaya, defended Britain's continued involvement. Betty felt confident that most British people did not agree with the MP. Soon afterwards, Betty and Len quit the Labour Party and joined the CPGB, where they became very active. Betty successfully encouraged other women to become union members. Betty and the full-time union official helped organise a walkout by 300 women, the first ever. The workers refused to immediately return after management informed them they all needed to reapply for their jobs. After 3 days of further strike action, management thus climbed down and a famous victory had been achieved. Betty subsequently began collecting the union subs and later became the elected MOC, a role she held for 18 years. During that time, the strength, determination, respect and loyalty of the majority of the women meant they became the best paid in any paper mill in Britain. Under Betty's leadership, the men in the process department also joined the union.
Hi, I'm Kath G. And I'm Leslie Sharman, and we're sisters of our older sister who worked with Betty long time ago, and you worked with her for a little while, didn't you? Yeah. Didn't really know Betty, but I knew of her and what she'd done and what she'd done for the women of the East Lancs, especially the soil department where all the ladies worked, all the women worked. And my sister used to, well, she was my sister's hero or heroine, really, because of what she did for the women of the mill. So a few years ago, I think it was the year that Betty died, 2017, we went to a memorial in Manchester, in Hume, I think it was, really for on behalf of my sister who died the year before Betty. And we had a wonderful afternoon. Chris Bainbridge did his poetry. Maxine Peake said quite a lot, didn't she?
Yeah,
she was
did,
really good. Yeah. And we had a buffet, and so it was a good afternoon. And I learned a lot more about Betty. And my sister didn't you?
And I think that's what was interesting, because there were people from all different kind of aspects of her life that day. I mean, we were coming from a point of view of knowing her when she was a lot younger, or knowing of her when she was a lot younger, and what she did at the East Lancs Mill. And
I mean, we were in CND, but we didn't remember Betty. No, we didn't remember Betty there. Although I did go down to Greenham Common on the day when she probably was there, but not on the coach that I was on. On the day that they did the arms around, we linked arms around the fence. So she probably was on one of the coaches on that day, but I didn't know that. But I don't think in those days it was very likely
that women would have got equal pay at that time if it hadn't been for people like Betty going out of her way to fight for it.
And I think seeing the young, seeing young ones here today, when you think of what's happening to the working class, and the lack of any union, not having union support, and we know how crucial that is, and I don't think young people do, because they don't remember the days when there wasn't any, and how important it was to have unions and to be united.
Yeah.
So I think.
A lot of the men didn't agree with it at the time. I mean, we had a brother that worked at the East Lancs, and he didn't agree with women going to union meetings. He thought they should be at home getting the tea ready, didn't he? But there you are. That was the way of things then. Everything's changed now, obviously, but for the better in some ways. So yeah.
Well, Betty said that she was doubly discriminated against at work. She was discriminated against as a female, and she was discriminated against as a working class woman. And she took that anger and that discrimination and poured it into her activity in the trade union movement. But Betty wasn't alone. I mean, she was part of a Northwest tradition of working class women being active in their unions and in other political organisations. I think it's important that Betty's history is recorded in this film, in the fact that she produced her own biography, which is available at the Working Class Movement Library, and the many little films and interviews that she did over the years with people such as me. It's important for past women as part of that wonderful Northwest tradition we have of working class women's lives and activity. And it's also important for younger women activists today to tell them you're not alone, you're not unique, you're part of a wonderful tradition, and it's important that you take advantage of that and become active yourself.
Betty's union organiser abilities were recognised soon when she was elected to represent union members across Radcliffe on the Union District Committee. She was also elected onto Radcliffe Trades Council, where amongst many activities she successfully led a campaign to get new toilets at Glynn School. Local children baptised them Tebbs toilets. As an MOC, Betty invited new workers home, where she explained the necessity of being a member of a trade union and its history. Betty opposed the foreman's distribution of the best jobs to his friends. Management thus agreed to examine the order books when women felt there was discrimination in the distribution of work. In 1958, Betty, by then the women's representative for the Northwest District of her union, was chosen as a branch delegate to the biennial conference. There were 311 delegates, of which around 40 were women. The Karen Vale branch had proposed the following motion: that a 40-hour week of 5 days be applied for without any loss of the weekly wage for shift workers in our paper and board mills. A nervous Betty spoke in favour of the resolution, citing the additional work of women in doing the shopping, washing and work in the home, so that in no time at all it was Monday morning. She backed a 40-hour week, a drop of 8 hours on the hours currently worked by full-time workers. The resolution was passed. Betty had rejoined the Labour Party after she and Len had quit the CPGB, as they felt that the Soviet Union had failed to understand the background to the Hungarian uprising in 1956. Betty later became an elected Labour councillor. Betty was also delighted to represent the union at an international women's conference in Switzerland. She attended with her colleague Isa Niven from Scotland, with whom she built a great friendship over the years. As well as enjoying the experience of an overseas visit, Betty returned having listened with intent to a woman speaking on equal pay for work of equal value. Said Betty, "This put a qualitative change to what we had previously demanded. the opportunity to do the same work as men and get the same pay. But now there was a recognition that the value of work done by women was in many cases as equal, if not more skilled, than that done by men. When Betty was subsequently chosen as delegate to the TUC Congress, she introduced this progressive change in her contribution from the rostrum. With Len receiving an offer to work in Cheshire as a tutor, it left Betty needing to quit work at ELPM so they could stay together. Leaving Radcliffe was an emotional moment for Betty, especially in the mill where many women gave her personal gifts and a collection was held throughout the finishing end of the mill to make a joint gift. She asked her union about a local factory where the women needed organising. It was Chadwick's, Warrington, where the weekly wage was 7 guineas, £7.35. Betty had never heard anyone talking guineas before. Her pay when she left the ELPM was £18.50. Chadwick's, a paper bag factory, was a grimy workplace. In a breach of the 1961 Factories Act, workers were forced to eat lunch at their machines. The factory walls had not been painted in over 30 years. Previous attempts by outsiders to unionise Chadwick's had seen the owner threaten to throw Betty's sister-in-law in the nearby river. As Betty gradually gained the women's confidence, union membership rose accordingly. Betty was elected MOC. She then pressed the factory manager to improve dinner time facilities and construct new toilets. When this failed, she twice approached the factory inspector in Warrington, and eventually new toilets and an eating room away from the machines were installed. The women were pleased and backed Betty's demands for better wages, especially for women workers, the majority of whom were skilled, who were not even getting the male labourer's wage. As branch chairperson, Betty attended her union's 1966 conference in Edinburgh, where she joined with others, including London's Bob Doyle, who had fought in Spain as a member of the International Brigades, in trying to embarrass the union leadership to not only back appeals for equal pay for women, but to vigorously campaign and negotiate for it. The realisation that her hard graft had lifted the wages of her fellow workers from 7 guineas a week to around £14 to £16 in just over 3 years led to Betty quitting at Chadwick's. After working at the co-op, she retired to undertake an Industrial Relations and Trade Union Studies diploma course at Middlesex Polytechnic in 1975 and 76. It was her chance, denied as a youngster, to undertake further education. For her course project, Betty chose the Factories Act and women's employment.
She very quickly got the other students organised because some of the workers at the Poly were on strike. And when she got there, she found that some of them had crossed the picket line. Well, that was about enough to see her face go as red as her hair. She was really angry, and she got into the classroom and she went to town on them that they should cross the picket line. She was very, very angry.
As she became more knowledgeable, Betty altered her viewpoint, concluding that all workers, male and female, needed more protective legislation. She contended there were no need for different retirement ages and it should be made 60 immediately, with 55 the aim. No one should work more than 35 hours a week. Pregnant women should be given light duties. Where the nature of a product doesn't require continuous production, then the factory legislation should stop night work. She recognised that it was not legislation that was preventing women from getting the training they needed, but attitudes of employers and some men. She urged the TUC to increase its organising of women. It proved a wonderful year. Betty had started a Warrington women's group which sought to get a home for battered women, only to be told by local councillors, all male, that there was no need for such a place as no one had asked for one before. Whilst considering what to do next, she was rung by the chairwoman of the National Assembly of Women, asking if she would represent the organisation at a working women's conference in Hungary. Betty then managed to get her local women's group to swap names to the Warrington NAW branch. Betty believed that being associated with a national organisation meant her local group would be stronger and have more structure. Whilst continuing to meet local councillors over the proposed women's refuge, Betty then discovered that a group of middle-class women and men had set up a women's aid group. When her own group delegated 2 women to attend the WAG meetings, they were made unwelcome, and Betty struggled to persuade her colleagues to maintain their involvement. Betty was made chairwoman of the fundraising group, and after a series of events, money was raised to buy a cheap 3-bedroom terraced house. After the building was opened, Betty noticed that it was the women from the NAW who took on the responsibility for the refuge, as the middle-class women just disappeared. When social services contacted the home, it was the responsibility for whichever volunteer was on call to pick up and maintain ongoing welfare support for the woman and her children who needed assistance. This was an exhausting task, and eventually only a handful of volunteers could maintain their involvement. The refuge was kept alive when social services agreed to take over the running at night, with NAW members doing the days. This was still no easy task, and Betty frequently found herself in situations with aggressive partners objecting to women leaving the family home. Betty's attendance at the conference in Hungary in 1977 started a long, active role within the NAW. She attended executive meetings in London. Getting working class women involved was prioritised. The NAW was affiliated with the Women's International Democratic Federation, which was closely associated with the Soviet Union, which led to the Labour Party proscribing its members from joining. Sadly, Len then died. A suitable ceremony was needed, and Betty was able to call upon Lancaster University lecturer Max Aderath, who had written a pamphlet with Len about the CPGB, to make what proved to be a marvellous oration. The Internationale was sung heartily. Betty, now the elected chair of the NAW, thus became a member of the 30-strong WIDF Bureau, and she was delighted to meet the chair, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, and Vilma Castro, who had landed with Fidel Castro in the boat Granma when they reclaimed Cuba from the USA. One special bureau meeting was when 2 women, one from Palestine and the other from Lebanon, addressed members and spoke of the horror of the massacre of Arabs by Zionists at the Sabra and Shatila camps in 1982. As women, men and children were mown down, nearby US soldiers refused to intervene. Betty had taken with her money raised by the NAW, and when she presented it to the 2 women, they broke down in tears.
When I first met Betty, it was in the Communist Party, but she was already, I think she was the chair of the National Assembly of Women nationally, and I wasn't a member. So the first job for her was to get me to be a member, which she did. So I joined, and really, in many ways, that was the most important move for me because of what it led to. Now, I joined the National Assembly of Women, and I stayed, set up a branch in Rochdale, and then she and I would go together and visit other branches and talk to them and so on. But her plan was to get me on the executive committee. She always believed that you should push younger women to do stuff so that older women could just pass on the experiences but not do the work anymore, which was fair enough. So eventually I got onto the executive committee, and the role of the National Assembly of Women was to send women from all over the world to countries where women were in struggle, and to do interviews, and then to write reports which would be published and sent in 5 or 6 different languages around the world to all the women's organisations that were affiliated. One of our sister organisations was the General Union of Palestinian Women, and Betty was really interested in it, but she was very interested in trying to get me to go and visit and do interviews and things like that, because my background, although I've been an atheist since I was a teenager, was from an Orthodox Jewish family that came from Eastern Europe, and she thought that was fascinating because she hated religion of any kind. And there was one other Jewish woman in the organisation who was a lot older than me, and I shouldn't have thought very fit. And so Betty argued for me to be the one to go. And the executive committee agreed that I should be the one to go on their behalf to Palestine. And so I went in 1986. And it was all a bit of a mishmash, really, because they didn't tell you what you were going to do because it was very sensitive. So they told you fairy stories, really, that you had to tell them at the airport and everything. So I was allegedly going to a peace conference in Jerusalem. And I thought that's what I was doing, because they didn't tell me. And so I went, and I was met in Jerusalem by some women from the Israeli women's organisation, which was also affiliated, and they supported Palestinian women, and they had Palestinian women who lived in Israel in their organisation, and they met me at the airport and looked after me and took me to a hotel. And then it was funny because, you know, I just said, you know, what am I going to, when does the conference start? And they looked at me and said, what conference? I said, I thought I was coming to a peace conference in Jerusalem. And they said, no, you're going to be taken to a hotel, and tomorrow you'll be collected by 2 Palestinian women. One speaks English, one drives, and you're going to be taken over the border into the occupied territories, where you're going to spend all of your time travelling around and interviewing families and women about living under occupation. So I took a hard swallow and I thought, oh, bloody hell, I've only got 1 roll of film. So I said to them, I've only brought 1 roll of film with me. And they said, oh, don't worry about that, we'll get your film in the morning, which they did. And these 2 women came to pick me up the next day. And I was with them for the whole time there. They just took me everywhere, all over the occupied territories and Gaza, to interview families and women who'd been in prison, and eventually some of the children who were in prison as well, Palestinian children in Israeli prisons. And but I realised, of course, that I couldn't say anything to anybody because nobody knew. They all thought I was at a peace conference, and I thought, if I talk to my husband on the phone, I can't tell him, because by then I knew that the secret services would have been locked into the phones in the hotel. And so I couldn't say anything to anybody because I couldn't get anybody in trouble. She was very pleased with what I did, and I gave a report back to the executive committee and everything. She was very happy. that that's what I'd done. But what it did for me, she did realise, because I told her, it changed my life completely. From that day on, yeah, she was my sidekick when it came to Palestine. Supported it in every possible way. She was amazing. So it brought us even closer together, really, because we had an additional cause that we believed in.
In 1986, Betty was delighted when Valentina, who had thrilled the other women when she told them of her space journey, asked if she would join her in speaking against nuclear testing to 10,000 women in the Lenin Stadium in Moscow. This proved to be a highlight of Betty's active involvement within WIDF. Betty was the final speaker and voiced her belief in the need to expose in our country the propaganda that the Soviet Union is our enemy. Because if there is no enemy, then the uselessness of these weapons of mass destruction becomes clear. This is the important task facing our movement and the wider peace movement. The 1984 and 85 miners' strike was the bitterest industrial conflict to date in Britain, and Betty naturally wholeheartedly backed the striking miners and their families as they fought for jobs and the survival of their communities. Members of the Rottenstall NAW branch were active in the Rosendale Miners Support Group, based in the Bake-Up Labour Party room, that collected food and clothes for North Gorber, a small South Yorkshire pit village. She wrote a bulletin about women who were providing a substantial meal to families of striking miners. Betty also wrote many NAW letters, including in May 1985 to Saddam Hussein, denouncing the build-up to an attack on the autonomous Iraqi Kurdistan region by Turkey, for which the Iraqi leader was providing logistical support. She demanded an end to these war preparations. 3 years later, Hussein launched a chemical attack on Iraqi Kurds that killed 5,000 people of all ages. Few Western governments condemned Hussein's savagery. Betty was dismayed by the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of communism across Eastern Europe. For 1 week, she journeyed across both West and East Germany in 1990, seeking to find progressive trends within the drive towards German reunification. She found the task very difficult, but was pleased to see that the Metal Workers Union were pressing for a programme of arms conversion. But she was left saddened that in the East, many citizens were being forced to take low-paid jobs when their factories were closed down. Back home, Betty had the great pleasure of meeting Winnie Mandela at the MSF Union National Headquarters in London. Nelson Mandela had been unable to attend as he was still suffering from exhaustion following his release from his decades of incarceration. Betty was approaching her 70th birthday when she stepped down as NAW chairperson, a role she had fulfilled with great enthusiasm and considerable success for 12 years. Betty thereafter continued her peace movement work as secretary of her local branch of CND, in which role she had attended the Manchester Coordinating Committee for CND branches. In 1992, she spoke at a well-organised Friends of Palestine meeting in Oldham on peace in the Middle East. Betty moved to Prestwich in the late 90s and became immediately active alongside Neville Ball, a retired draftsman.
I first met Betty when she moved into the area where I live. She'd come from somewhere like Warrington or somewhere outside Manchester, outside the Bury, Manchester area. And she wanted to join our local peace group, which she did. and she became the secretary. But when National CND said there was going to be 365 days of activity against nuclear weapons, that appealed to Betty, and she wanted to go up to Faslane, where the nuclear base is. So I said, well, if you're going, I'll go. And she had friends that came from Fleetwood, Alan and Jean Johnson. They came over to Manchester. Alan stayed with me overnight at our house, at my house. And Jean stayed with somebody else, and I can't think who it was. But the following day, we all set off to go to Faslane. But we had to go up to Glasgow first on the train, and then from there we got a bus or there was something like that. And when we got to Faslane, we had to do it sort of quickly and not hang around and get noticed by the authorities. So I can remember going down this banking, and Betty would have to do the same. And we arrived on this road which went past the base. So it was there that we were going to blockade. So we all lay down in the road. There was 3 men, 3 youngsters, who we didn't know, but they were involved as well. So they lay down in the road, and we actually blocked the road to the base. And eventually, after an hour of lying there on the road, we decided to get up. We'd made our point, and of course straight away we got arrested. Betty was arrested, but because of her age, she was, I think she was 89 at the time. She was like released, if you like. But myself and Alan Johnson and the 3 lads were arrested, and we had to go to the local police station where we were kept overnight. And we slept in this, well, there was a bit of a thing on the floor like a mattress, but not very thick. And we had to lie on that overnight. And they woke us up in the middle of the night to go and take our fingerprints. That was done deliberately to disturb our sleep. But the next day, we had to go to, I don't think we went to a court, but we went to somewhere where the police were there, and we were formally charged. The Procurator Fiscal sent us a letter each saying, you've been arrested and detained overnight. We don't want to see you again. If you appear again doing what you've done, we will arrest you and you will serve a prison sentence. Well, knowing Betty and what she stood for made me even more determined to become active myself. At that point, we used to have a stall in the local precinct, shopping precinct, called the Longfield in Prestwich. And we used to have a stall with all literature on it, and we used to talk to people about peace and what CND stands for. And that was basically it, you know. She made a big difference. She seemed to have more enthusiasm. Not that we didn't have enthusiasm, but she had more get up and go kind of thing, you know. But she got us more involved. And when she said she was going to go up to Faslane, I said, well, I'm coming with you as well.
Well, she was very much a working class woman, and and she could see the kind of life that her mother had led. And of course, as a child, they'd made her go to Sunday school and all that kind of stuff, which she hated. And she wasn't at home with so-called middle classes. She was at home with working class people, worked in a mill like she did, or a factory. And that's how she influenced them, I think, because she was one of them. She wasn't somebody else telling them how to do it. It was what she was doing, and she was living it, and she was active. And so it became very real for her. And also, I suppose, because she knew the working class was the largest class, you know, and so she felt she was part of something, very much so. And although she and I had very different backgrounds, I'd always felt that. I'd always felt that being working class was the most important thing. And she was very keen on getting statistics, so if she needed to know how many working class people there were in Britain, you know, she'd find out, so that she had that as an answer when people used to challenge her. Betty and I tried to talk about communist theory, and especially when we were reading political books, but she wasn't very strong on it because she was much more an activist than a theorist, if you like. But her husband, Len, taught her an awful lot because he was very keen on theory, and he taught her a lot. She was very fiery, she was very strong, and she also had, I think, the charisma that people believed her and followed her and everything like that. She was very angry, and she was like that on all women's issues.
Betty's long-term work on behalf of women was recognised in 2010 when she won the Elizabeth Gaskell Award at Manchester Council's Women's Awards. Betty continued to pressurise trade union leaders into action by writing to them, urging them to take strike action to oppose the austerity agenda of the Tory Liberal Democrat coalition government. In 2015, she spoke at the GMB Women's Conference in Liverpool, where she urged elected representatives to keep contact with their members in the workplaces and to take the initiative in approaching management on behalf of members. In September 2016, Betty was accompanied to the Labour Party conference in Liverpool by Linda Clare.
So in 2016, I accompanied her, or took her, to Liverpool, to the Labour Party conference, to the Fringe meeting where she'd been asked to speak. And she knew most of the people on the platform, like Len McCluskey and one or two others. And it was quite a big platform, actually, but the problem for Betty was her hearing was bad as well, so she couldn't see who put the hand up to ask a question because she couldn't see who it was. And so I sat next to her on the platform, and I would point out the people who wanted to ask her a question. And I mean, she was minute, Betty. She was really tiny. And then you've got men like McCluskey, you know, and she'd taken him to task a number of times over peace. And the whole question of the industry that his members would be in, that would be making weapons and things like that.
We can't have socialism without peace, and we can't have peace without socialism. Now it is time. We can't wait any longer. The time for action is now. And the bottom line is, it's up to us.
Because she was a force to be reckoned with, and when she spoke, as little as she was, it was with a very forceful voice, because she was passionate about peace, and she had been since the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was her life. and she was absolutely passionate about it. And so she got a wonderful response, wonderful. And afterwards people came to her to want to talk to her, you know. So I used to sort of ferry people around her so that she could see them and speak to them and everything. And I mean, I was always very proud to be sat beside her, got to say, because all the time I learnt from her. And when I didn't agree with her, I told her. Yeah.
With Betty, she was not only a comrade, she was a friend. We became friends, you know, and I spent a lot of time in her flat just chatting about world events, you know, politics mainly, peace, anything that we wanted to talk about, you know, which was involved wars and things like that. And we got on well. We got on well, and I used to visit her quite frequently and spend time with her, just sitting, chatting about things, you know.
I learnt everything from her, and she was just incredible. And if she was talking like at a union meeting, the women in the audience were just carried along with her. She was so passionate, you know. And I think also because she was so little, they wondered where this force came from. But she was, and she put it all in practice, you know. When the nurses were on strike, she'd be on the picket line with them, early in the morning, you know. And she'd hire one of these scooter things in Manchester to go on one of the big demonstrations, and she'd have a great big placard in the basket park. She would just go everywhere and talk to everybody about it. And yeah, she did a lot of persuading women that their role was to support other women.
Without the help of friends and my family, friends like Linda and Neville, support me, and also especially to my daughter Pat. Constant care, I want to live in the life I'm doing, you know. And then of course to all of you for coming here tonight and listening with patience. Well, a long number of years, isn't it? And well, it's just thank you all for coming and contributing to help the women in Palestine. Thank you.
Small token is we're making Betty tonight an honorary life member of Bolton.
As Betty entered 2017, her health gradually deteriorated and she died on the 23rd of January. Her beloved daughter Pat was with her when she died. Her humanist funeral at East Lancashire Crematorium in Radcliffe was well attended, and the mourners left the chapel to the words of Joe Hill by Paul Robeson. Betty's death was marked with obituaries in many publications, including the Manchester Evening News, the Times, the Independent, the Daily Mirror, the Guardian, and her beloved Morning Star.
Never one for airs or graces, Betty had one of those faces that lit up the darkest corners of the world. As she fought for peace and truth, she became the living proof, and this woman's work began when just a girl. Standing up for women's rights, she took on a lifetime fight so that all under oppression could be free. And I wish that in our schools they taught Betty's golden rules of natural justice, peace, equality. In this poor, benighted land, she could never understand why some people ploughed to royalty and fame. Perhaps Betty's one regret was she never got to get the Queen's telegram to send it back again. Betty couldn't stand it that our one and only planet might one day fire the bombs and breathe its last. So from Radcliffe to Rangoon, let's all sing a rebel tune and consign atomic weapons to the past. Now let's all raise a big flag for Betty, a hero of the workers through and through. Fight the good fight, just like Betty. Always ask yourself, what would Betty do? Thank you.
Nationalise the railways and the steel industry. These two are they're necessary to put the rest of the country on the road, and also put the health service back on track, and education, and much more.